Your first flipped classroom lecture that you can kind of get used to the system with is a very simple overview of the geography of the United States. There are no practice homework questions associated with this or anything like that, but you should watch and practice your note taking with this because there are certain things that I can tell you about the trends on the Regents exam of what you should really know for what the exam deems important in terms of geography. First things first, you have to know the 50 states. It's helpful if you know some of the capitals too, but that's not as vitally important as knowing the 50 states. Now, I realize that this isn't necessarily the easiest thing in the world, but when I refer to a state in the Union, you should be able to picture in your mind at least the region of the country that falls into. So some of the states are easier to identify based on shape, such as the original 13 states after the Revolutionary War. That being said, it gets a little more difficult when you get to these more square-looking western states, like Wyoming and Colorado are very commonly mixed up. You should at least know when I say Wyoming or Colorado that those are Rocky Mountain states. Which brings me to the regions of the country and how they are referred to. So the Northeast is generally considered the states of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. Then you have the Southeast, and I won't name them all off again, but you can see that colored in yellow here. They also have what is referred to as the Midwest. Now, this map that I found online lumps what is referred to as the Midwest in with the Great Plains, and that is very, very inaccurate as far as the terminology that the New York State curriculum and the State Regents exam will use. So the Midwest is often referred to as the states that fall into the Ohio River Valley, which is the southern border of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. The states of Michigan and Wisconsin as well. Sometimes Minnesota, Iowa could be considered Midwest, but we will instead include those in the plains. So this is the Midwest. Then the Great Plains, as you can see, I recolor-coded this map for you. That is the Dakotas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, Kansas. This is the Great Plains. This is largely flatlands, not entirely, but largely flatlands with a lot of farming going on. Then you have the Rocky Mountain West. You have the Southwest and Pacific coastal states. And then obviously you have the outliers of Hawaii and Alaska. So these are regions that when I use these terms, or terms like them, I won't often use the term Pacific coastal. However, I may say the West Coast, in which you should picture in your mind California, Oregon, Washington. So on top of knowing the 50 states and where those states fall into place regionally, I would know these regions by these terms. Now here's a little goofy map that I don't have very many art skills. So a lot of stick figures. My train in the Southwest looks like a roller skate with a smokestack. My apologies, I don't have very good art skills, but hopefully my lack of art skills and your laughing at me will actually help you remember some of this stuff. So anyway, the map of the western expansion of the United States. How did the United States gradually make its way west and achieve what James K. Polk would refer to as manifest destiny? Well, first you have to start even earlier than American history and talk about European colonization. which we will get into more detail of the story of that in our next lecture. But some of the first settlements in the New World, in 1607, you have Jamestown. That's actually mislabeled on the map as 09. 1607. Then in 1613, you have New Amsterdam. In 1620, Plymouth. So both Plymouth and Jamestown were settled by people leaving Britain, and New Amsterdam was settled by the Dutch and eventually overtaken by Britain. So these are your first early settlements. These are kind of significant dates, but probably nothing that you would be asked to have memorized. The old Regents exam, which is now referred to as the core curriculum, the new exam is referred to as the framework right now. And the framework, I don't know what to tell you to expect from the framework. I've never seen a framework exam yet. This is going to be the first year of the framework. That is the 2021-2022 school year. So for those of you listening to this in the future, there might be more advice I can provide in class. For those of you that are viewing this as a brand new video, I don't have a lot of tips for you from the framework exam, but I can provide you with the tips that used to be extremely important on the core curriculum exam, and hopefully some of those trends will remain and be helpful tips for a long time. So during the colonial period, the British and French are fighting over who gets to control North America. They want to control all of the fur trade, any of the tobacco production for themselves. So they're warring over who gets the control of North America, mainly the Ohio River Valley. Nonetheless, at the end of the French and Indian War, referred to in Europe as the 7 Years' War, because it was actually fought in multiple places, you have a proclamation by the British government, and we will go over this in a lot more detail when we cover that, that says you cannot settle past the Appalachian Mountains. That was issued in 1763. So in the old Regents exam, they used to ask questions such as, what was the western border of the United States in 1763? Or actually, I should rephrase that, the American colonies in 1763. Wasn't the United States yet. And the answer is the Appalachian Mountains. Then they might ask, what was the western border of the United States in 1783? Now that has much less to do with the colonial period proclamation of 1763 and more to do with the end of the American Revolution. So the western border of the United States at the end of the American Revolution is the Mississippi River, because the agreement between America and Britain established this western border. And so what was originally the United States was western border of the Mississippi River. So these two dates are important on the old exam, not sure if they will be on the new exam, of what was the western border of the American colonies in 1763. Answer, the Appalachian Mountains. What was the western border of the United States in 1783? And that is the Mississippi River. Now you're going to notice that for the most part, these dates that you're seeing on the map are starting along the Atlantic coast and gradually working their way westward. There are some exceptions to this, but not many. So my funky drawings, King George III, American colonies, things like the Proclamation Line, new taxes. You can see my angry-looking King George. Then you can see my George Washington. The best I could do was a head of hair with side curls. Then you can see in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase stretched U.S. control to the Rocky Mountains. And so I have a Napoleon and Thomas Jefferson striking a deal between the French Empire and the United States for the Louisiana Purchase. Then you have what is commonly referred to as the Lone Star Republic, which is essentially the state of Texas, but in between having declared independence from Mexico and joining the United States. And that happened in 1836, and the best I could do is a cheesy Lone Star Republic flag. Then, what are these question marks in this 10-year window of time between the Lone Star Republic and Texas joining the Union? Why is that there? And what is this with lines colored in territory here? Well, you'll learn more about this in detail, but there's a disputed territory. Mexico thought that the border of the state of Texas was the Nueces River, which is right about here. The United States declared that it was the Rio Grande, which is there. And so the Mexican War is actually intentionally started by James K. Polk. Again, we'll go over all this when we get to covering that period of history in a whole lot more detail. But then after that war, the United States gained the Mexican Cession, and even prior to fighting the Mexican War, just before, there was an agreement with Britain to gain the Oregon Territory, so you can see James K. Polk and his angry faces. And then a few years after the end of the Mexican War, you have the Gadsden Purchase, which was purchased entirely for flat areas to build a railroad. So there are some things here that you can refer to as hopefully helpful periods in history, helpful dates in history, that used to be asked somewhat frequently on the old exam. Unfortunately, I can't tell you for sure whether things will be on the new framework exam, but nonetheless, I wanted to point these things out so that you are able to make note of them in case they continue to be a trend on the new exam. So that concludes your very first flipped classroom lecture video. There are no attached questions to this. So if you have any questions yourself, however, after viewing this, something caught you as odd, or you want to ask a follow-up question, please don't hesitate to ask in class.